Hey, and welcome back to the Devlog series for my 2D survival horror game, Never Forgotten, which you can wishlist now on Steam. So, last week I mentioned I was getting back into the swing of things regarding the development of the game and devlogs. In the time since then, I finished the basic outline for the third chapter of Act 2, which means all the puzzles are playable and the framing for each scene is finished. After that, I began work on functionality of planned enemies for each chapter. The enemy for Chapter 1 of Act 2 is completely functional, though it's still using prototype visuals and has yet to be balanced. And since I've yet to show off the process behind making enemies, I thought I'd go over that today, as well as giving the enemy a design. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've already done a little bit of concept art for this enemy, which is based around narrative elements the enemy is supposed to reflect. This enemy, the Festering Soul, represents the learned soul being weighed down by their guilt as blades erupt from within them. Very edgy. Festering Soul is deliberately placed in a dead end in the level, reflecting the way the learned soul viewed confronting their guilt instead, opting to keep running away from it. The attacks this enemy have include two powerful currents of corrupted blood which suffocates the learned soul, and two blades slowly closing in from either side of the learned soul. When designing these attacks, I realized that I need to explain why the blood here hurts the player instead of healing them, especially since I plan on including pools of blood which heal the player later into the game. The reasoning I came up with was that the blood which resides in creatures of essence, the monsters in the game, slowly becomes corrupted and diseased, forming into a black substance. For narrative reasons, this substance, because it's infused with essence, hurts the player and doesn't heal them. Well, anyways, I'll show off the programming for the enemy and how each is structured. So, each enemy in the battle scene is instantiated as a child object to one of the enemy objects. Each battle is called from the overworld and has a set of enemies which to be involved in that battle. So when the player walks through a trigger that activates a battle, it sets everything up and it instantiates the enemies then. So each enemy object holds the base stats for each enemy, stats such as their health, attack, and defense values, as well as a few other miscellaneous ones. Now here's where things get a tad messy. When I was originally prototyping the battle system, I ran into an obstacle, that being, how do I write one script which handles the attack functionality for every enemy? The answer I came to is I didn't have an answer for that. The main reasoning being that I wanted a lot of attacks to do a lot of different things, and I also didn't want to restrict myself to having a designed template for each attack, and I instead wanted to be able to be a little bit more free to kind of, do a little bit of custom scripting for certain attacks. With that in mind, I opted to go with the solution of giving every enemy their own unique script, from which all the functionality regarding their attacks would be written. The way the enemy object class refers to the script is in the attack function, which is called once. It runs a switch statement and checks for the corresponding name of the enemy and pulls a hard-coded reference to their appropriate battle script. By the time the game is finished, this list will most likely be around 20 to 30 enemies long, which isn't exactly ideal, though it is the solution that I've settled on. Since the original prototype, a few ways I could have potentially optimized this have occurred to me, though how reliable these methods would be, I do not know. Not without prototyping them and testing them, at least. And given the current system in place works just fine, I'll leave it as it is for now, especially since it's a tad too late to restructure systems like this that have 1 billion moving parts. The Festering Soul script itself is structured like each of the other enemy scripts. In their update function, they simply check if it's the enemy's turn, and if it is, then they check for which attack it is being run and execute the corresponding function accordingly. Their select attack function simply just decides how they choose which attack to execute next. As you can see, attacks are run by coroutines, in which the correct attack and player states are set. Buffer time for each attack is also set initially to give the player a bit more time to adjust before they're showered in bullets. Coroutine then waits out the duration of the attack before resetting the attack state to null and then waiting an additional length of time to give any recently spawned bullets time to fall to the bottom of the screen or do whatever else they need to do. Then, the battle manager is called to advance the battle state, and that just brings it back to the player's turn. Now taking a look at the blood pour attack, you can see that the function first subtracts a value from the attack rate, and then checks to see if the attack rate is greater than 0. If it is, it will return out of the function and continue this until the attack rate is less than or equal to 0. Now this value in question being Time.deltaTime, I can't explain how it works in a professional sense, but to kind of explain how it works, at least the way I think it does, is that it's a value which remains consistent relative to a defined time scale in Engine, and it's designed to allow things like physics calculations to be reproduced reliably regardless of the current frame rate. The reason you tend to see games locked to certain frame rates is because all calculations relating to physics and timers are designed around the game operating at a defined frame rate for various reasons. Some examples that came to mind include Undertale, Hyperlight Drifter, Dark Souls, and some others. In Undertale and Hyperlight Drifter's case, I believe it has to do something with a limitation regarding the Game Maker Studio 2 engine, or at least the version those games use. And in Dark Souls' case, I believe it mostly has to do with the fact that each of the games make use of the Havoc physics engine, which I believe is tied to a game's frame rate. This is also why Physics get all fucky in Bethesda titles running at frame rates higher than 60. To get back on track though, you can see that there's a check for Reset Blood Pour Index, and I'll get into that in just a second. So to quickly explain how this attack works in simple terms is it selects 2 lanes to spawn projectiles in, and then it waits a little bit, and then it does that again. The switch statement here decides which lanes to spawn the projectiles in, dependent on the random blood pour index. Now the value that I mentioned earlier, the reset blood pour index, is there so that when the attack is called at the start of the enemy's turn, it will choose a random index to start the switch statement with. The reason I chose for the attack to play out in a sequence like this is because I wanted to avoid a reoccurring issue with attacks I've designed like this in the past. That issue being projectiles spawning in the same lane several times in a row, so I've designed the attack in a way that the player always has to be moving. Okay, so now that the lanes have been selected, 2 projectile objects are defined so that I can refer back to them as variables, and for the sake of just readability. The projectiles are spawned in their corresponding positions, and after they are instantiated, I call the setProjectile function, which sets the stats for the projectile. SetProjectile function takes 2 inputs, a projectile object and an integer disclosing what the current attack index is. Turning to the blood pour attack now, the function sets the current attack rate to the appropriate value for this attack, then returns out of the function, though I believe the return here is completely pointless, but it isn't doing any harm, at least to my knowledge, so here it shall stay. So that's the general gist for how enemies work in Never Forgotten. It took a little bit of time, but we got there eventually, and anyways, on to the design process now. Even though I do have some concept art to base the design off of, I want to draw up a more detailed and refined version. Something important to note here is a lot of this detail will be lost in the pixel art version given I'm working with a 48 by 48 sized canvas. But it helps to have all this detail so that I can kind of pick and choose which aspects of the design I'd like to focus on. So, now on to the pixel art process. If you've seen my making art video for Never Forgotten, which has a fucking thumbnail I can be bothered to fix, you should be somewhat familiar with my process. Tend to sketch out the general shape of the object, doing a tad bit of detailing by erasing because it's just black and white. And then the basic outline is finished. When that happens, I shade. Though for larger pieces, I tend not to shade in excruciating detail since dithering takes a while and I suck at it. For enemy sprites, I also need to make some animations for them, all of which are incredibly simple since I suck at animating. And also there's 2 different versions of exported sprites for enemies, an overworld version with an outline and the battle version without an outline. Okay, with that finished, I can go ahead and implement that into the game now. Alright, so now with the art implemented, I'll go ahead and play test now just to show it off in game. Alright, so it's placed in this section, this big pile of flesh, and it's blocking your way, so you need to fight it. Attacking with it, yeah, I am scared. See the animations are working. These are still using prototype sprites. Cool. I can see that it turns into little arms just kind of sticking out the ground. I'll have to add proper actual, but I'd even do a collision on these and proper sprite like order rendering here. That is it. That is the video. Outro now. We go to outro. So that's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed. As always, thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. I do really appreciate that. I'd also just like to quickly apologize for rambling a bit as well as not having super great takes. I tend to make these videos in a day or so that I can spend most of my time focused on the game, and this leads to me rushing the recording process especially. Anyways, if you're interested in the game, wishlisting it over on Steam would be greatly appreciated, thanks. And with that said, I shall see y'all next week. Until then.